A very warm welcome to everyone, and it's particularly warm in Stockholm and I think in many other places as well this time of the year. And I'm very glad and proud to see you all at this third Stockholm Centre of Eastern European Studies webinar on a very timely and an important topic. My name is Fredrik Löjdqvist, and I assumed the position as the first director of the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies this spring. I have a background at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Sweden and served as Sweden's ambassador to the OSCE 2012-17, where I was, among other things, colleague with Dan Beer, which we have on our panel today. The Stockholm Centre of Eastern European Studies is an independent centre that provides policy-relevant analysis and work, and is providing a platform for meetings and discussions on Russia and the 6 Eastern Partnership countries. It was established through a Swedish government decision and is based at the Swedish Institute for International Affairs, UI. As you know, today's discussion is based on the 3 first reports in a series out of expected 9 to 10 reports dedicated to the subject of human rights and security in Eastern Europe. This report series is related to the OSCE, which Sweden chairs this year, and the role of the international community with a focus on human rights and security. Some of the aims of this series is to keep the protracted conflicts in Eastern Europe on the political agenda, not least, and also to highlight the negative consequences regarding human rights and humanitarian situation. Secondly, it's to provide a fact-based analysis of the current situation, but also the underlying causes of these protracted conflicts, including shedding a light on the link between respect for democracy, human rights, and rule of law on the one hand, and security between states on the other hand. This is exactly what the OSCE comprehensive concept of security is set out to do. And thirdly, and then not least important, to identify possible concrete policy steps that individual states, the international community, and civil society can undertake to ameliorate the situation and formulate policy recommendations. The topic of today also raises larger questions on responsibility and accountability. Who is responsible for upholding law and order and adherence to international law and international commitments? For instance, UN, OSCE, or Council of Europe. And what are the mechanisms for accountability? What mechanisms do we have to monitor violations of international law and commitments, and including on human rights violations in the conflict areas? Today, we have with us a stellar panel where Andreas Umland, a senior fellow at the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies, who is also co-editor for this report series, will make an introduction presenting some of the results and conclusions of these reports, which focus mainly on Donbas. And then we have 3 panelists who will comment and expand on this. Maria Zorkina, who is a political analyst at the Ilko Kuchirev Democratic Initiatives Foundation and co-founder of the Kalmios Group. Secondly, we have Dan Beer, senior fellow at the Europe program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and who served, among other things, as US ambassador to the OSCE 2013-17, which was a crucial time period for the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And lastly, Nikolaus von Twickel, an Eastern Ukraine analyst for civicmonitoring.org and an editor at the Center for Liberal Modernity in Berlin. He served as a media liaison officer for the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission in Donetsk from 2015 to 16. We will have this presentation and the panelists talk in one block, and then we will open up for questions and questions from the audience and comments, and then we will return to the panelists. My hope for today's discussion is not only that we have an informative and nice talk, but also that we are able to identify concrete ideas and policy recommendations for the future. Some housekeeping rules. For those of you who watch this through Zoom, please ask your questions in the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom bar, in the middle of your bottom bar at your Zoom window. But this event is recorded and also live streamed on Facebook. And for those of you who are on Facebook, you can put your questions on in the comment field where you can send in your questions. And please, when you put a question or make a comment, please state your full name and your affiliation. And please also keep it short and concise. The webinar can be viewed on the UI website afterwards. With this short introduction, I would like to hand over the word then to Andreas Umland to an overview of these three reports on Donbas and Ukraine. Please, Andreas.
Thank you, Frederick. There's a strange appropriateness that we are having this webinar today on the 26th of June 2021, the 80th anniversary of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. And the strange appropriateness here consists of the fact that the separatism and the support of the separatism in eastern Ukraine was very much done under the pretense that there is an anti-fascist intervention necessary, and the symbolism that these so-called people's republics have been using the last 7 years for their separatist fight against the Ukrainian state is linked to the Red Army's symbolism. The Red Star is used, the St. George's Band, and the entire justification for these for this invasion of Ukraine was that there are allegedly widespread human rights violations either happening or feared, when in fact what we now have after 7 years is the exact opposite of the of this, in that the human rights situation in the eastern Ukraine has deteriorated gravely. And for instance, Halja Koinash in the first report in our series starts with the comparison of the Freedom House scores for Ukraine, for Russia, and for what is called, according to Freedom House, the Eastern Donbas. So Ukraine is certainly not on the top in terms of human rights protection worldwide. It has only 60 of the 100 points that are possible in this Freedom House ranking. But the Donbas is now ranked with 4 points out of 100, even below Crimea, which has received 7 points in this ranking. And our reports, in a way, they reflect that. What we are focusing in these 3 reports on is not so much the geopolitics of the conflict, but the problems that we have in this area in eastern Ukraine, in the occupied territories, and on what to do in the meantime until we will get hopefully to a solution of this conflict. There are already 2 online also presentations of this report, one in English that we did before with Halja Koinash, the author of the first report on the human rights situation in the Donbas in general. She's from the Kharkiv group, Human Rights Protection Group. Then there is a Russian presentation of the second report done here in Kiev, from where I'm speaking now, with Stanislav Asiev, about the issue of prisoners exchanges and the torture prisons in the Donbas. And this year session today is mainly, as I see it, and Frederick already indicated, is mainly concerned with recommendations. And that is also what our reports distinguishes perhaps from other reports. Maria Zolkina and Nicolas von Twickel have been very deeply, much more deeply than most people here, I guess, involved in reporting about what is happening in the occupied territories. And these reports try to make a contribution to this already large reporting by providing recommendations. So I will simply summarize here the main recommendations that were given by the authors in the 3 reports, and will then hope that our 3 commentators will perhaps then add something. So the first report, Halja Koinash speaks about the necessity of sanctions, the importance of the sequence of the importance of the implementation of the Minsk agreements, the difficulty with conducting elections in occupied territories. She speaks about the necessity of information for the people living in the occupied territories, and issues like education, the access of education, Ukrainian education to young people from the occupied territories, the necessity of already drawing now a reintegration plan. The second report with Stanislav Aseev was about prisoners exchanges and torture prisons, and we speak there about the necessity to register human rights violations, to secure access of the Red Cross, of the UN, the Council of Europe, to the territories and to the imprisoned people, the necessity to involve more than before the international courts in solving the situation. And in the third report, finally, which is perhaps the most specific and most policy-oriented report on the special monitoring mission, I recommend, and this was a recommendation very much based on conversations with a whole number of SMM and OSCE officers. These recommendations are about the freedom and autonomy of the special monitoring mission, which is hampered by the fact that Russia is part of the OSCE and therefore also framing the conduct of the special monitoring mission. There's the issue now, perhaps the commentators here can comment on the issue of the Gukovo and Donetsk additional special monitoring mission, which is the second monitoring mission, which is now under question. We speak about the necessity of better access for the SMM to the, or of actually any access, relevant access to the Russian-Ukrainian border, ideally also to Crimea. The necessity to better report military equipment not used by the Ukrainian forces, to increase the presence of the SMM in southern mainland Ukraine, and to abstain from involving the SMM in non-core activities, like, for instance, issues in Western Ukraine with the Hungarian minority. This is an overview of some of the recommendations given in these three reports, and I would now be very interested to see what our commentators have to say on the reports and what they maybe have to also recommend to the international community.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for this brief introduction. So, Maria, please, we are all very keen to hear your comments on this.
Thank you. I think that when we speak about the possible support or the possible intervention, actually, if I may say like that, of international community into what is going on in temporary occupied territories or regarding the conflict resolution, we have to divide this possible involvement into two main tracks. The first one refers to humanitarian support, which is, in my opinion, is on the pretty good, well-organized level. And regardless of the closure of the entry and exit points, the humanitarian support and the humanitarian assistance, almost without any obstacles, if to understand under what circumstances everything is organized, is still sent to the temporary occupied territories, both in Donetsk and in Lugansk regions. Sometimes what I see in, for instance, in informational space of Ukraine, we even have the problem of, of understanding why in the time of the full actually deadlock regarding the negotiations and regarding the full access of international organizations to what they need to have access to in temporary occupied territories, all the humanitarian programs work like they were pretended to work. And sometimes we have to explain to certain audiences here in Ukraine that humanitarian assistance shouldn't be or isn't, according to international law, be dependent on how political component of the conflict resolution looks like. But this is just in order for our listeners to understand that in terms of humanitarian assistance, in my opinion, all the involved international organizations tries to do what they can do in time even of the pandemic. At the same time, with humanitarian assistance, we still have rather reasonable rather reasonable issues and problems. They refer not just to some programs with sending some goods to temporary occupied territories, but with operation of the teams of international organizations exactly in non-governmental controlled areas of Donbas. And here, regardless of the fact that this position was one of the most important in, for instance, in Paris summit conclusions since December 2019, we have almost no progress in this regard. And this is one of the most important obstacles for full-fledged and for full-fledged involvement and for full-fledged functioning of international organizations, mainly of the Red Cross and SCEEUS, though these organizations or these missions have two different, let's say, tasks, and they operate in different directions, in different areas, but at the same time, both of them still have problems with having access to the places where they are going to have access to. It means that we have no possibility to somehow organize Red Cross visitors to be able to see prisoners like they demand to this fact to be organized. And since spring 2020, we have maybe the hardest obstacles, the biggest obstacles for SCEEUS to work and to access different zones in non-governmental controlled areas of Donbas. And unfortunately, as of now, I don't see any opportunities, any practical opportunities for neither for Red Cross nor for SCEEUS in NCGA to receive what they had to receive according to their mandate. I mean, this access and freedom of movement around non-governmental controlled areas. The only way out for fulfillment of this task of this task of these missions is to create some informational agenda regarding this issue, because as an analyst working with the topic, I see that this is really a disadvantage of or disadvantage or the other, let's say, side of the coin when some organizations try to be, let's say, neutral or politically correct as much as possible, and sometimes it decreases their own capacities and their own opportunities and ability to face concrete challenges, because here we are speaking not about political engagement of Red Cross or about political engagement of SCEEUS, but we speak about their own capacities, their own obligations, their mandate, and if they will follow up everything with rather intensified informational messages about the fact that they cannot and what should be done in order that they will be enabled to complete their work in non-government controlled areas, it would contribute not only to the conflict resolution and to humanitarian situation in NCGA, but also to functioning of these teams of this organization themselves. But there is another track of international community involvement, and it's more, let's say, political one, because it relates to current attempts for the conflict resolution, for some preparations for possible reintegration, for looking for the compromise, etc. And here we have two basic problems, which or two contradictory points. On the one hand, Ukrainian authorities since 2019, when Volodymyr Zelensky became a president of Ukraine and he received his mono-majority in Ukrainian parliament, Ukrainian authorities have decreased as much as possible the discussion about possible involvement of international community into conflict resolution and conflict management in terms of concrete international mission. Regardless of the lack of progress in negotiations, officially and practically, on the level of negotiations, I mean authorities, I'm not an authority, we still, as a state, do not come back to the active discussion of how we see the possible international mission to be applied, to be organized, what kind of mission do we support, and what can be done. And here, and this is like one pillar of the current situation with involvement of international community. So the lack of incentives regarding some kind of missions or broadening of the mission on the side of the Ukrainian authorities themselves. And the second pillar is that the fact or the experience of international conflict management history, that this is not possible to look for successful and stable conflict resolution without involvement of international missions, preferably with the mandate for temporary international administrations in order to govern these territories during some transit period. And these two contradictions, they actually change they have changed the negotiation landscape over last couple of years. And now, when Ukrainian tactics for having intensive dialogue with Moscow and to try to reset negotiations have shown that it was not successful because Russia simply didn't change its negotiation position regardless of the readiness to compromise on the side of Ukrainian authorities, it will take a lot of time for Ukrainian negotiators now to return to discussion about international mission. And there is still no consensus within Ukrainian authorities on whether we should proceed with the idea of United Nations mission or with, for instance, other possible missions like broadening of OSCE mission and using the possibility, which has never been used by OSCE for its missions, to have not only civil but also even military component within the mission. So there is the problem with the concrete definition of what we actually want and what will we go forward with. At the same time, as Andreas wrote in his report, and I will support this conclusion, that the idea that we have to fully rely on the idea of armed SMM OSCE mission in order to stop the fire and in order to organize the conflict resolution. This is a rather risky idea, and I would recommend to try to avoid this idea, though it can seem to be maybe the most easiest way, having in mind that in UN we have still veto of Russia and nothing will happen. But in OSCE, the situation is not much easier with any kind of strengthening SMM OSCE when it comes to hard power instruments. And I think that one of the needed actions which should be applied now is the consultations, closed door but active consultations between, for instance, Ukrainian authorities or other international actors interested, I mean moderators of the Normandy format or other or chairmanship of the OSCE, to have a closed door discussion about possible perspectives of any kind of changes regarding mandate of SMM-OSCE, because that might be just a losing time. I mean, Ukrainian authorities can be just losing time trying to set up this idea into negotiation area, but it will not be successful when there is, if there is concrete opposition and serious opposition to this idea under the OSCE umbrella. And now but before I'm going to short introduction of some recommendations, I think that we have witnessed, all of us have witnessed already, that the idea of some kind of involvement of international mission as one of the instruments to solve the conflict, we have already seen it. How we slowly come back to this idea, because to those clusters which were proposed, which were offered by Berlin and Paris several times ago within Normandy format, Ukrainian authorities have made not several, but significant corrections on its side. And one of the most significant offers to those clusters on the side of Ukraine were to broaden SMM-OSCE as much as possible, and in order to enable this mission, acquire some security guarantee features and characteristics. For instance, that the idea that the control over the border first, and only then conduction of some kind of local elections in temporary occupied territories should be guaranteed and organized by taking the control over the border by, first of all, SMM-OSCE, and then by Ukrainian border control, which will guardians of which will join, the staff of which will join SMM-OSCE, doing everything on their own, first of all. And to sum up everything, I will name couple of recommendations. So first of all, the first one I have already mentioned, that we really need some Chatham House rules, intensive closed door dialogue between the current and the future, several future chairmanships of OSCE, both on institutional level and on the level of intergovernmental contacts between Ukrainian government and countries which will chair the OSCE, about different perspective of whether we should move in this direction, and whether we can expect something more, maybe not like a military and police mission, but at least some more instruments, larger staff, new opportunities or capacities when it comes to next prolongations of SMM mandate in for the temporary occupied territories in Donbas. The second issue, it is based on the making the problem with lack of access to the and limitations of movement for SMM-OSCE and Red Cross in non-governmental areas. So both this organization and Ukrainian side have to make it one of the most important messages when it comes to conflict resolution discussion, because this is the precondition for at least minimal possibilities to follow the situation with humanitarian issues, with security issues, and with people's rights, human rights in temporary occupied territories. So not only Ukrainian side, but also these organizations should make it like one of the main political demands towards Russia, like the same one as the demand for the ceasefire and lack of violations of the ceasefire. The third recommendation or proposal actually refers to what is going on now in Minsk Trilateral Contact Group. Since several months, we have witnessed very dangerous tendency when representatives of so-called republics who have been participating in Minsk TCG as an invited persons, they have enlarged their delegation, so-called delegation, to Minsk working groups and to Minsk Trilateral Contact Group in general. Though they cannot and they have no opportunities because they are not party of the conflict, they are invited by Russian side representatives of temporary occupied Donbas, so they are not regarded as the party of the Minsk TCG. They have no rights and capacities to enlarge their representation there and to actually deal as they are like they are a full-fledged party of this negotiation format. And unfortunately, their idea not to be, let's say, very maybe concrete when it comes to SMM OSCE moderators in Minsk TCG, they, let's say, keep political silence in response to this rather proactive, rather aggressive negotiation tactics on the side of Russia. And this is one of the most important new developments in negotiation practical process since last month. And I think that there will be not a mistake if the leadership of OSCE will contribute to, let's say, more accurate position of SMM moderators in Minsk TCG in order to return the format of negotiations, who is who, into at least the previous model, when people invited by Russia cannot asymmetrically, just because they wanted, enlarge their representation, bring anyone they want. And this is the task of the moderator, to follow that all the participants play according to the previously agreed rules. That's the last point, but not the least.
Thank you very much, Maria, for a very comprehensive overview of various dilemmas and challenges, and also for your recommendations. Dan, you have represented the US government at the beginning of this conflict, and you have also had a very strong personal engagement in human rights and humanitarian affairs. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Frederick, and thank you, Andreas, for the overview of the reports. And Maria, I'm really grateful for the refresher course, because I've been away from the conflict for several years, and it is your presentation was an expansive covering of all of the various intersecting issues, I think, that lie in front of us in terms of moving towards conflict resolution. I'd like to make three kind of general points, or 3 points, and then hopefully 4 recommendations as we think about both the kind of the practical recommendations that came out of the reports, as well as the broader taking stock of this conflict that unfortunately is now more than 7 years old, which is hard to believe for me as one of the people who was kind of in the early parts of March 2014, wondering what was happening. To see it in this place 7 years later is, I mean, I suppose it could be worse, but it also could be much better, obviously. So the 3 points, the first one is about principles and the importance of us coming back to principles as we work towards practical solutions. I think as an OSCE hand, one of the things that I often think about is that none of the principles that were laid out at Helsinki were actually novel ideas at the time. It wasn't that this was the first time people had spoken of human rights, or the first time that they had spoken of not changing borders by force. but it was the grouping of them, the bundling, that was the novel idea. And one of the things I'm struck by as we listen to on the ground details about Ukraine, or as we look, indeed, take a wider aperture and look across the European and Eurasian region, is how much every conflict that we face proves the wisdom of the OSCE concept of comprehensive security. And, you know, unfortunately, we see everywhere that violations of human rights, that the undermining of human security is something that leads to interstate conflict and more violence in the form of war. And so I think it's really important that we I know it sounds trite, but you have to come back to those fundamental principles, and as you start to craft a way forward in terms of practical solutions, and to remember that they have been shown to be correct, empirically correct. And if I can add a note of optimism as an American right now, I think, you know, one of the things that's encouraging for me about the early rhetoric of Joe Biden and the Biden administration is that I think Joe Biden has a deep personal sense of the idea that human freedom and democracy are essential to building a peaceful world, and that for him, it is self-evident, the kind of linkages between human security and broader international security. And so I'm hopeful that he will continue to lead an administration that will be committed to those principles as well. The second point I wanted to make is about the mechanism for diplomacy, or the mechanisms for diplomacy in the case of the conflict, the Russian-caused conflict in Ukraine. And you know, Maria's points at the end about needing to be smart about the mediation that goes on in the form of the TCG. You know, I see the TCG as a primary point of conversation about the Minsk agreement and how to implement Minsk agreements in their proper sequence, et cetera. And then in parallel, there emerged the Normandy format. And I have to confess that I have always been skeptical but supportive of the Normandy format's efforts. And I think, you know, one of the challenges that's in front of us is how to frankly get the United States engaged in the Normandy format. I don't see the 4-point Normandy format as being able to sufficiently bring the influence of the international community to bear on driving forward practical solutions in the diplomatic process. And I want to be candid about acknowledging that especially under the Trump administration, I think the United States lost a lot of credibility because as the world saw that the United States was using Ukrainian authorities to play out its own petty political drama back home, you know, that doesn't do great things for the United States' credibility as a constructive, interested party in helping to move towards a resolution. But I think, again, the Biden administration, not only in its words, but also in its personalities, has individuals with a long history and long commitment of trying to see a principled solution to the situation on the ground. And there needs to be an effort to figure out how to integrate the United States into the Normandy format, I think, in order to add more political oomph to the support for diplomatic work going forward. And the last point I want to make, and this is not to exclude other things, but is about what I'll call the content of problem solving. And Andreas, you alluded to in your summary of the first report, the point about needing to think about reintegration even now. And I guess the point I'd like to make there is that I think one of the problems with protracted conflicts is that we stop daydreaming. We get so, I mean, the same conversation over and over again about sequencing and about the hurdles to various things. And all of those are, I mean, you have to have those, we're having those conversations over and over again because we need to solve those problems in the near term. But I think one of the things that we should force ourselves to do is also to keep daydreaming about what a resolved conflict looks like. And in that sense, to think not only about reintegration, but about what reconstruction looks like, what it feels like for people on the ground in the Donbas, what kinds of new economic linkages might be possible, what kinds of reconstruction of infrastructure and economic opportunities and educational opportunities for young people might be possible. I think too often we don't allow ourselves to discuss those things, partly because we are so focused on the near term. And that's and the point of discussing those things is not to skip over or pretend away the very real challenges about getting control of the border back and getting Russian and Russian-sponsored personnel and equipment out and holding free and fair elections of high quality. I get that those are all important and they remain important to me, but I think also daydreaming about what comes after can be useful in reminding ourselves of what's at stake and how human lives can be improved by an actually constructive process in the long run. So my policy recommendations going forward are first, concretely, that I think probably Berlin or Paris should invite at the ministerial level consultations first of France, Germany, Ukraine, and the United States, and then on a second day, perhaps, or in the afternoon of that day, the full Normandy plus, what I'll call Normandy plus format, sometime in the coming months. And that I think then that would create an opportunity for the Swedish chair of the OSCE to also, in the context of the OSCE ministerial this year, to welcome a Normandy Plus meeting on the margins of that, which the Swedish chair could kind of introduce or join an introduction, which leads to a second kind of a second recommendation under the that might fall under that, which is that I think it would be very useful for the Swedish chairmanship to pull together in one document a chair's statement of recommendations on the way forward for the SMM and for the observer mission at the two border checkpoints. There are so many disparate kind of, they should do this, they should fix that, the mandate needs to include this, the problems with access include that. I think it would be useful to have an authoritative chairperson's viewpoint on how the OSCE, SMM, and observer mission on the border could most effectively move forward in the next year or two, and to maybe present that not only to all participating states, but also to transmit it before the meeting, before a potential meeting of a Normandy Plus group on the margins of the ministerial. And then a second recommendation, or I guess third recommendation, would be that somebody should organize a kind of reconstruction reimagined conference that allows people to do that daydreaming that I was talking about. I think it would be useful, and I know that's an unconventional one, but I think somebody should organize that. And then the last is, and here I don't actually have a concrete recommendation, but I am quite struck by the universality of the kind of passion and emotion and concern for human dignity that is bound up in the issue of prisoners. And I think it would be a constructive contribution to the international community for some state or group of states to try to unpack and be creative about thinking through the issues that relate to prisoners. And one of the questions to me is kind of there's such value in identifying political prisoners as such, but there's also great sensitivity in that. And I wonder how we can approach prisoners in the context of conflict. And this is something that applies not just obviously in Eastern Ukraine, not even in the OSCE region, not just in Eastern Ukraine, but obviously the latest conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan also has enormous sensitivity and emotion bound up around the issue of prisoners and prisoner exchanges. In some format, we need to kind of reapproach that issue, both on the question of principles and also practically, because we find that is a stumbling block repeatedly. And I think it might be worth taking a step back and having somebody kind of dig in there again. And I have thoughts on the international mission and stuff like that, but I'll leave those for discussion and hand off to Nicholas.
Thanks, Dan, for these very succinct points and quite concrete recommendations. So now we have heard a view from Ukraine and a view from the US, and now we will hear a voice from Europe with a very hands-on concrete experience from the conflict in Ukraine. Nicholas, please. Unmute.
There you go. That was the test. Thank you. So what I can say, what I want to say here is really very, very short and concrete things. First of all, what can the international community do? This is a conflict that is fully through and through international. This is nothing local. If there wasn't Russia, if there wasn't the EU, there would never be a problem, a conflict in Donbas. We all know that. This is completely thought up in Moscow. This is the situation where, or the origin of the conflict was thought up in Moscow as a reply, as a reaction to what took place not just in Kiev in 2013-14, but all the negotiations with the EU about an enlargement and the wider EU neighborhood policy. I don't have to tell you that. Those who suffer from this conflict are, of course, the locals. So the international community has a very, I think, should show the strongest possible commitment to solve this conflict, which has been ongoing now for 7 years. And the suffering at the local level is becoming worse and worse, especially with last year's pandemic, which I think will go on for some time, given the rate of vaccinations and what we're seeing in Russia right now. So I think the message to the international community must be quite clear that it is our responsibility in the international community to see that this conflict gets solved sooner than later. That's the first, I think, fundamental issue. The second is now what Maria said. I found that an interesting, even a time machine type of thing. She was talking a lot about a UN mission and a different OSCE mission, something that we've heard a lot under the predecessor of the current president of Ukraine. I must say, I'm a deep skeptic. Indeed, I'm a very forceful pessimist about this. I don't see this happening ever in the near future, that we have UN, some form of UN mission, UN troops even solving the conflict on the ground in Donbas. I think that the past 30 years that we have 30 years experience of post-Soviet conflict management along the borders of Russia have shown us that Russia has become less and less willing to accept any form of international presence in those conflicts that it likes to fuel and prolong. We've seen UNOMIG, the UN mission in Georgia. That was a military mission, but it was unarmed and it failed in the end, and it had to give up when Russia pulled the plug. There was an OSCE mission which also failed, and now we have an EU mission in Georgia, which is nice, but we all know the EU mission has no access to the non-government controlled territories. And so coming back to Donbas, I think we should very much support and also appreciate the work that is done by the OSCE SMM. And I would like to make a few well, not corrections, but I would like to argue that I don't see the problem with limiting of access and restrictions for the OSCE mission as serious as it is often prescribed in Kiev, and as Maria has suggested, and also Andreas has written in some of his reports. I mean, I have not been in Donetsk, back to Donetsk since 2016, but I know perfectly well that the OSCE mission still has its headquarters, its regional headquarters in both Luhansk and Donetsk. So there's no restriction for the OSCE mission to operate outside the non-government controlled territories. Yes, we do have restrictions that in the sense that certain roads are sometimes blocked, and that certain routes sometimes are not passable, and that yes, at the border with Russia, there are certain areas where the OSCE mission gets told that they have to leave within a short time. This is mainly the problem in the so-called Luhansk People's Republic, not so much in Donetsk. But by and large, the OSCE mission is able and is operating in the non-government controlled areas. And I think we should do the most we can to appreciate that and to foster future an even better functioning of the mission, rather than criticizing or rather than exaggerating the problems with access. Of course, now we come to the question, how to solve the conflict. I must say I'm also a pessimist regarding the Minsk agreement. I've just written or recently published the annual report on the latest developments in Donetsk and Luhansk. And I don't see any indication that there is a political will, be it in the Kremlin, be it in Moscow, be it in Donetsk, be it in Luhansk, to implement the Minsk agreement. All we're seeing over the past months is going in only one direction, and that is integration with Russia. Integration with Russia. There are of course, when we're talking about human rights, the problem is that the so-called People's Republics are today black holes, or you can also call it white dots on the map. Nobody really has nobody from outside, especially from Ukraine or the West, can much influence on what is happening politically on the ground, except from Moscow. And this problem is increasing, and there is only one thing that the West can do in this respect, and that is put pressure on Moscow in all forms of in all sorts of formats that we have. Thankfully, Dan has spoken about the Normandy format, and I'd also like to stress the role of the Trilateral Contact Group, which, of course, because of the pandemic, has not met in person since more than a year now. And we all, I think, we don't know whether and where it will meet again in person because of the situation in Minsk right now. That is, I think, also going to be a big problem for this conflict in the future. Again, I just would like to say I don't see any international troops, any international mission, and I don't see, for instance, the OSCE. I mean, I appreciate the OSCE mission's work, but I don't see the OSCE mission becoming an armed mission. This is something the OSCE has never done before, and there is absolutely no personnel around to do this. You would have to, replace all the people who are there right now with other people, with people who are able to bear arms. And I don't think that Moscow would ever go down this path and agree this. And we always have to, of course, remember the OSCE is a very useful, has shown to be a useful organization in this respect. But of course, the OSCE operates on the principle of unanimity, and there's of course always a big animal in the house that can veto any of these interesting theories that we can bring about changing the mandate of the OSCE mission. We always have to reach an agreement with Russia. So this is I think my conclusion. And regarding policy options, regarding policy recommendations, I mean, I'm just as frustrated as many are in Ukraine and maybe some in some pro-Russian people in eastern Ukraine as well. Not least speaking about Russians proper, about the inability of the Trilateral Contact Group and indeed the Normandy format to reach any tangible political results. My idea was has long-standing been to maybe bring in a more active role of the European Union. I think it is very deplorable that right now there is no one who's really who you would like to talk to in Brussels about this. I mean, there are lots of people you can talk to, but there's nobody who's individually, singly responsible, and who is the first and foremost person to deal with these issues. Secondly, there is also the missing track from Washington. There is no Code Volker at the moment, and there is I don't know whether the Biden administration will appoint someone soon. I guess this is a question to Dan, but I think the past 6 or 7 years have shown that it's much up to the Europeans to do the hard work in this conflict resolution, whereas the American contribution has been, of course, very much appreciated by the Ukrainians. But since the Americans have not, for whatever reasons, never been in the Trilateral Contact Group or in the Normandy format, of course, this has proven to be to be of not much avail. But I don't want to belittle what Dan has said, and I'm not a diplomat. I'm not an expert on these things. Maybe Normandy Plus can move things forward. Maybe some fresh thinking from diplomats from Washington and Europe can move things forward. But overall, I don't want to be overtly pessimistic, but right now at this moment, I haven't seen any initiative from the West, from Europe or the US that has given me confidence that things will change fundamentally over the course of, say, this year or next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas, for this quite sobering analysis, but also for good recommendations. We have now a good half an hour for questions and comments. And again, for those of you who are participating in this webinar on Zoom, please ask your questions in the Q&A function in your Zoom program. It's in the middle at the bottom bar of your Zoom program. And those of you who watch this through Facebook can ask questions through the comment field, and it will be forwarded then to me. I have two initial questions here, and I find it also quite interesting that none of you really mentioned or brought up the quite significant Russian military buildup that we experienced in March and April along the Ukrainian border, but also inside in Ukraine, in Crimea and in Donbas. And I think this was also a reminder that this is not a frozen conflict, and there are several policy options open in the Kremlin, including military escalation. It was a loaded gun that was put on the table. What effect did this military buildup as a security signaling have on policymakers in Washington, but also in Kiev and in Berlin and Paris? I think the silence from Europe on this, and especially from Berlin and Paris, was quite astounding. So that's the first question. And also, what are the conclusions drawn in Kiev from this? The second question, and this was partly touched by Nikolaus, on sort of a creeping de facto annexation. We've also had passportization, which we have seen before in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Is this a desirable? Is this a way where we're heading, where the non-government controlled people's republics will be de facto annexed by Russia? Wouldn't Russia sort of lose an important lever in the negotiations? And what's going on the ground there? So these are the two first questions. I don't know who wants to pick up on any of these. Nikolaus, your microphone is on. Does that mean anything?
I would like to point to Dan for the question about the first question you asked. But if you want, I can quickly say only there's one thing about the Russian military buildup, which I indeed have been following closely, and I certainly don't have a clear answer to what it was meant to be, and I certainly would like to hear an answer from the German Foreign Ministry to answer your question about the perceived silence in Berlin, or indeed from Paris. I don't know the answer to that question, but my personal opinion has been quite. I've become a great fan of the. Is it Yuri Kaufman, the analyst from Washington, who no, Michael Kaufman, who is the who said immediately this is much more to do with Washington than with Ukraine, and this is the Kremlin waving with tanks and saying, here we are, we have something here we can talk about with the new incoming US administration. I think it was much to do with posturing, with signaling, and not so much with preparing the ground for a new invasion. That's all.
The one doesn't necessarily exclude the other. I think the baton has been passed on to you, Dan, and I think you gave a very supportive analyst and view of the Biden administration. At the same time, as this was ongoing, Biden extended the invitation for a summit. It also pulled back battleships that were planned to go into the Black Sea. And there has also been obviously a freeze on planned military support to Ukraine. So what exactly, what are the lessons drawn in Washington, and how important is Ukraine going to be in its future Russia policy, and how was this military buildup interpreted in Washington?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's too soon to tell kind of the priority that the new administration will place on this, but I do think it's important that, you know, Tony Blinken was involved as Deputy Secretary of State. You know, I attended OSCE meetings about Ukraine with him in 2015, 2016, and so, you know, and Toria Nuland is now our equivalent of a political director, and obviously has been engaged for a long time. Wendy Sherman is not new to this. She was the Undersecretary of State before. So the personalities are certainly at the top of the State Department, at least, are certainly not fresh to this issue. And Jake Sullivan was the Vice President's National Security Advisor at that time. And so he has been, I can remember making phone calls to Jake to update him on the progress of SMM reporting and access and stuff like that as far back as 2014. So all of these people know this conflict and understand its origins in Moscow. And so, you know, in that sense, I think I'm confident that there will be serious discussion. You know, the spring in retrospect strikes, you know, it's easy to look at it in retrospect because there wasn't an invasion. I agree with you. The fact that there wasn't an invasion doesn't mean that that wasn't, or a new invasion or a new escalation doesn't mean that that wasn't on the table or even an intention at some point, just because it didn't happen. In retrospect, it looks like the classic kind of escalation to de-escalate tactic that the Russians use, where they create problems and then use those problems in order to get a high-level diplomatic meeting that they want, where they offer to do something maybe to solve the problems that they've created. So, you know, in retrospect, it looked like a gambit to get a summit with Biden and get the recognition that Putin wanted as a global player. And I think that leads to, you know, one of the broader point here is that I think that in the international community, we often conflate being purposeful about understanding the situation in Moscow and what Putin's view is, and legitimating that view. And I think we should recognize that, you know, Moscow has a veto on a lot of things, and has interests that run counter to resolving this conflict. That doesn't mean that we legitimize those views, but it means that we look at them practically as we try to craft solutions. And, you know, in many ways, I think Putin is stuck because he has a declining society. Certainly economically, the future of the Russian Federation is not good. And he is, in some sense, trapped in this kind of endless cycle of trying to find different ways to compensate for Russia's looming economic failure. And he has no way out. You know, a lot of people see Putin's extending his presidential terms as kind of the classic autocrat wanting to stay in power forever. The fact is, there's no process of succession. He can't leave power. It's not necessarily that he doesn't want to. I mean, if I had hundreds of billions of dollars, I might seek to enjoy retirement at some point that I have stolen. I might seek to enjoy retirement at some point, but he can't. And I guess that's a long preface to saying, you know, when we think about the possibility of quote unquote de facto annexation, that's the worst case scenario for Putin in some sense, because he doesn't want to own this problem. He doesn't want to own financially the costs of reconstruction. He's made a bunch of promises to you know, baloney promises, empty promises to people on the ground of Russia's support that he doesn't intend to fulfill. He's got a bunch of heavily armed people who think that he is their you know, sponsor and patron. He doesn't want to make good on that promise. It would be expensive. It would be politically disruptive to him. So, and as you said, he would lose the leverage of using that as a tail to wag the Ukrainian dog. And so, you know, I think that it's not clear to me that de facto annexation is something that that Moscow would welcome, even if they will continue to kind of disrupt things through passportization, et cetera. I think actually one of the things that's incumbent on the international community is to lay bare the lie that Moscow does intend to be a long-term sponsor of a good life for people on the ground. And again, that's part of why I think it's important to imagine what a good life looks like, because I think we need to contrast that with what's on offer from the other side. I guess I unintentionally talked about both of your questions, Frederick.
That's all right. Maria, in Kiev, in Ukraine, how was the military build-up this spring interpreted? What are the feelings after the Putin-Biden summit? And we know that President Zelensky had been quite vocal about reminding Biden that he was interested in meeting with Biden as well. And also, is a de facto annexation of DNR and LNR, is this something you're fearing from a Ukrainian point of view?
In political circles, there were more concerns about Biden and Putin meeting than among experts, because actually maybe the bilateral context or bilateral relations between Office of the President in Ukraine on the one hand and Biden administration on the other hand are not the case of the most successful start of bilateral relations in the history of UA and US relations. But at the same time, when it came to to summit between Putin and Biden, so actually before it and those concerns, those political concerns about what will be agreed or what can be agreed without Ukraine, regarding Ukraine, they were all these risks and concerns, they could be and they were decreased by the fact that in 2021 it is not possible to make a compromise regarding Ukrainian and Russian war without involvement and legitimization of this compromise, not only by Ukrainian authorities, but also by Ukrainian-wide public. And from this point of view, so time became an advantage for Ukrainian side. So on the one hand, the time, the 7 years, made the conflict a protracted one. And of course, the chances for resolution and reintegration, they are less when it comes to protracted conflicts. than with conflicts which are solved rather in a rather active and rather short-term period of times. So this is not the case anymore. But at the same time, over this period of time, we witnessed rather stable formation of rather stable public opinion. And it was like a safety bag. That idea with, for instance, lack of control over the border but conduction of elections, lack of demilitarization, disarmament, and withdrawal of Russian forces and start of political reintegration is also not possible from a public opinion point of view. So that's why experts were more, let's say, calm and rational when it came to both expectations before summit, and that's why we see that both sides received what they actually want. Putin wanted the summit itself in order to show its, let's say, geopolitical recognition of the Russia's power and influence. Biden had a different story, but when it came to Ukrainian issues, we didn't see any betrayal of our interest or something like that, of course. But it doesn't mean that relations with Washington regarding the possible involvement of US into negotiations correspond with what Ukrainian administration expected. And here we have like the result of some problems with the domestic processes in Ukraine, because for the US, as a new administration clearly sent the signal to Ukraine, they will combine these two tracks, like domestic reforms, corruption, transparency of public-owned enterprises into one basket with the security issues and resistance to Russia aggression. Generally, military build-up in Ukraine, of course, was a military build-up of Russia in Ukraine was assessed more seriously than both by experts and politicians and wide public as well, more seriously than in the rest of the world. But for diplomatic tactics or even strategy of Ukraine, the situation with this military build-up lead to the strengthening, in my opinion, should lead to the strengthening of the idea that security has no alternative. So security comes first, and no political compromises or concessions without guarantees for security, for fulfillment of security clauses should be done. And that's why like we had witnessed how ceasefire, it was not full-fledged, it was not stable, but there was some de-escalation on the front line. And we have seen how easily Russia has finished not only the ceasefire, but very rapidly developed the full-fledged capacities for new intervention actually, and not only on the land but only in the sea. And as of now, majority of these military capacities, they are not reduced by Russia, especially when it comes to the Black Sea region. And that's why I think that Ukrainian negotiators should insist more actively than they did before on the idea that we have to have not just frustrated discussion about security, but no discussion about any political concessions without clear security guarantees before any political compromises. If no guarantees, so status quo is much better.
Thank you. We have another a little bit more than 15 minutes left, and I'm trying to merge some of the questions here. I think one set of questions concerns the issue of other outside sort of Western involvement and policies towards Ukraine and Russia. And one aspect of this is that one person who asked a question here notices the lack of coherency or connection between the policies of a certain country or group of countries in bilateral and multilateral aspects and in different fora. And that this sort of lack of coherence of some countries and what they say to Russia and other countries and sometimes they try to play a good guy in one forum and a bad guy in another. That this could play into the hands of Russia, who uses this sort of double or ambivalent signals from some capitals. A question related to that concerns Germany's role and the fact that Merkel will be leaving. How will that be changed? How will that change the dynamic of Normandy and of Germany's role? And so that's one set of questions. The sort of ambivalent and sometimes incoherent and inconsistent signaling from some Western partners, but also what will happen when Merkel leaves. A second question is, I had it very here, concerns the, I guess many of you have read the interview in Financial Times with Surkov recently, where he, in a very sort of cynical but also very honest and open way, speaks about Russian plans for Ukraine and Crimea. And Judy Dempsey asked the questions whether any one of you actually believe that Russia will ever give up its ambitions on Ukraine. Maybe we have time also, because this I think will be the last round of question here. Is regarding the sort of the dilemma, and I think several of you pointed at this in your introductory statements, between the political imperative to try to achieve concrete solutions here and now, it's the shorter steps, on the one hand, and the other political imperative to uphold respect for international law and OSCE standards based on Helsinki and Paris on the other hand, that in order to achieve something in the short term and on the ground, you have to make compromises, which risks undermining the sort of more long-term goal of restoring respect for Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. For instance, by legitimizing the people's republics, on playing along on Russia's attempts to reformulate the negotiation formats and who are parties to the conflict and so forth. So the first question on does the West is the West really coherent and consistent, and what will happen when Merkel leaves? Secondly, is it even thinkable that Russia sort of will ever give up its ambitions on Ukraine? And thirdly, how do you see this very real dilemma of trying to achieve things on the ground here now, which is faced by the OSCE, SMM, and other international organizations, and the long-term goal of restoring respect for these important principles of the European security order? We have a little bit more than 10 minutes left, so I think we will make a round here. Our panelists, and I think Andreas has indicated here that he wants to start. So Andreas, and then the three panelists, please.
Yes, I guess Judy's question addresses also what Dan and Nikolaus have been talked about, some sort of principal solution, reintegration, UN mission, some sort of endpoint that we may reach, and I think I would support here Dan's idea that we should already today talk about reintegration and concrete plans, and we should, as was also recommended in one of the reports already, perhaps talk about a UN mission, because we don't yet know when things will change, but at some point they may change. You know, I think the reference point here would be what happened in Eastern Europe, and sometimes you see already what has happened in, for instance, East Germany in 1989, and some of the plans. The Steinmeier formula is in a way perhaps an attempt to apply the experience of the last elections to the Volkskammer, the East German parliament, in early 1990, when Soviet troops, 500,000 Soviet troops with personnel were still in East Germany, And the old regime actually conducted in East Germany a successful democratic election, after which then a successful reunification with East Germany happened. The difference to today is, of course, that Vladimir Putin is in the Kremlin and not Mikhail Gorbachev. And the doctrine that that Putin is following is certainly not the Sinatra doctrine that everybody can do it their way. So there's another doctrine there, but maybe in 2 years, in 12 years, in 20 years, who knows, at some point we will have perhaps another man in the, or women perhaps even in the Kremlin, and another doctrine. And for that case, once that happens, we should be ready, and we should have already some plan, perhaps for a UN mission, for a reintegration plan, and maybe even something like the Steinmeier formula could then be implemented with somebody, some other person in the Kremlin. So I think we should always prepare for the worst case scenario, but we should also prepare for a good case scenario, because at some point it may happen. Here about the buildup of the troops, I think the perception that I gathered here in Kiev was that people understood that this is only saber rattling, and that it may not lead to war. And actually, my perception here in Kiev was that people were surprisingly relaxed. But the problem here is, of course, that first of all, will the Kremlin always act rationally? And then there are some objective issues, like, for instance, the water issue on Crimea, that may drive the Kremlin then to new escalation. So the saber rattling was really scary here, but so far it has not led to a new major escalation.
Thank you, Andreas. And I suggest now we return to the panelists for a final round, either to shed some light of these questions. I try to summarize, or any other reflections and comments. And so we will start then with Nicholas, and please 2, maximum 3 minutes per panelist here.
Oh, thank you. I would like to bring up one point that I wanted to bring up but forgot. Thankfully, Andreas mentioned it, water. There's a very, very, very good paper written by the very respectable analyst who is based, I think, in Severodonetsk. Basically, it's saying that the problem with the coal mines that are no longer being pumped empty from water is becoming worse every year, even every month. Brian Milakovsky is the name. Sorry, I'm very prone to forgetting names in the short term. Sorry. Yes. So look up Brian Milakovsky's paper. It was published on the Ukrainian website Kritika, and it is really mind-boggling. It is really quite worrying. I've also been following some of the Luhansk-based and Donetsk-based Telegram channels, sort of anonymous digests of what is happening, but what is not being reported in the official separatist-controlled media, and that is also quite worrying. To make this very short, if we keep this situation ongoing for another couple of years, we'll face serious environmental and indeed human troubles, with the groundwater becoming undrinkable and unusable, and the whole area, a huge environmental catastrophe is going to happen sooner or later if nothing is being done against it. And that is, I think, a very, very would be a very good way of wakening up the international community and bringing more people to look at this conflict from a different angle, and put in more resources to bring a solution about. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikolaus, for that. And Dan, please, 2 to 3 minutes.
Great. Let me try to be efficient with time. First, a couple of points that, in response to previous points made. One, I think we should all be paying attention to the invitation that President Zelensky got to come to Washington next month, and look to that as a near-term juncture where you might see an articulation of U.S. policy commitments, as well as an agreement to work together between the U.S. and Ukraine in this new administration. Second, Frederick, you mentioned the recent headline about the pausing of a military assistance package from the United States. I don't rate that as particularly significant. And I think here too, I would wait and see what comes out of the meeting when Zelensky comes to Washington. I think that package was created in haste as the Russian military buildup was escalating this spring as a policy response to that. And while the buildup hasn't pulled back entirely, there was a pause to kind of I interpret it as a pause to rethink, given that there is now time to rethink. I don't interpret it as a lack of support for Ukraine, et cetera. And obviously there's a much larger array of assistance that has been ongoing and will continue, that I think will continue to be ongoing in the coming months and years. On your questions about Germany and on Judy's very important getting to the heart of it question, on Germany, I just flagged that there in the near term, there may be an opportunity within the US-German relationship, given the surprise waiving of sanctions on Nord Stream 2. I think it's frankly up to Berlin now to come up with really concrete ways of demonstrating support for the concerns that the US has about Nord Stream 2 and the way that it will affect geopolitics, particularly with respect to Ukraine. There may be an opportunity there to, in the US-German conversation, for Germany to come up with something real. And I hope that even though there is a leadership transition coming, that the Germans will recognize that it's on them to do that, and that the US has made a first move that is conciliatory to German interests, and now it's the Germans need to show that they are serious about the security situation as they claim to be. So that's an optimistic kind of, maybe there's an opportunity there. And on Judy's really important question about, will Russia ever give up? I guess I don't think Putin will ever give up a cynical desire to use Ukraine, not just regionally, but globally as a way of demanding attention, et cetera. But I agree with Andreas that one of the things that we can do in really hard situations is to be ready to walk through doors when they open, even if we don't know when they will open. And I guess in addition, I don't discount that in the near term there are thin areas of overlap where there are opportunities to make progress on the ground that are consistent even with Putin's illegitimate interest in controlling, the situation on the Russian border. And so I think there may be even opportunities in the near term to find ways to build towards progress before the major door opens at some point to be determined in the future. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dan. Maria, you will have the last word of the panelists, please. 2 to 3 minutes, your final comments.
Yes, I think I will make some remarks on the basis of the question regarding what is going on the government control areas, if there are some positive changes which can indirectly influence the possible reintegration or creation of the basis for possible reintegration, because people still communicate. So first of all, I would say that communication between people from government control areas of Donbas and non-government control areas of Donbas has significantly decreased during 2020 because of almost fully closed entry and exit checkpoints. In the late February 2021, we conducted around 200 interviews with people residing permanently in temporary occupied Donbas, and around half of them in Donetsk region, and around 45% of them in Lugansk region said that their links or their communication with the people from government control areas have significantly decreased or was fully stopped during the pandemic time. So just to understand that pandemic has rolled us back significantly in terms of exchange of information in this alive way, and in terms of using these instruments to influence social horizontal links between people on both sides for reintegration whenever it will start. But at the same time, we see that to some extent, while there are still problems with negotiations and lack of progress there, in domestic policy, there appeared a little bit more order and predictability when it comes to government control areas when it was before. And maybe this is logical. So when you do not have the tangible or visible opportunity to have a compromise and solve the conflict, you will sooner or later will concentrate on domestic policy at the areas where you are eligible and competent to do something. And in this area, so for instance, the new economic strategy for government control areas of Donbas was developed by the Ministry for Integration, and this strategy is based on the idea to make the business on the local and average level more easier, make it easier to create some possible to make it easier to invest in the region and to work there. We don't know. I hope it will be fully supported, because we need the money from the national budget for it. We need full support of other ministries and the cabinet of ministers in general. But this is a good step, because it means that we will have to show what is going on the controlled areas and if there are some good changes there. Moreover, during pandemic year, Ukrainian authorities has started developing as large as possible the administrative services for the people from the government, from the occupied territories. So the main goal is to create so-called the centers for administrative services close to every checkpoint, in order, to change how the system works now. Because before, the local authorities sometimes on government control areas were simply unable to absorb all the people who had the necessity and a need in some administrative services from the state. So there were like a double pressure on local administration. So now the general idea is that when checkpoints are open, we will have nice buildings with full-fledged number of services which can be provided by the state for all the people coming from the occupied territories. Later, better than never, I would say, but this is the positive signal. But yes, and the last point, we have now the law on transition period, which was also developed by the Ministry for Integration. It was not adopted by the Ukrainian parliament yet, but if it is adopted, it will significantly influence negotiation process, because in this document we have specific approach to how authorities and governing of Ukrainian legal bodies should be restored in the framework of reintegration. And this logic fully contradicts what Russia demands from us in negotiation process.
Thank you very much, and a warm hand of applause to our three panelists. I think we've had a very rich and broad discussions covering these issues from many different angles, and also providing us with some policy recommendations and ideas for the future. Also, a very warm thank to Andreas and Martin Krag, who are the editors of this report series, which will continue. We will have 3 more reports on the other protracted conflicts in Nagorno-Karabakh, those in Georgia, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia, and on Transnistria coming out later, and also 3 more general reports on the nature of protracted conflicts and also of the application of international law, applicability of international law to these, and the overview over the various negotiation formats and mechanisms. So please watch, keep an eye open, and we will continue this series and the discussions. Thank you very much also to a very active audience who has been putting a lot of questions and comments here. Unfortunately, we didn't have the time to answer them all, but they have all been duly noticed. And please also note that this webinar has been recorded, and you will be able to watch it on Facebook and also through the UI homepage later on. Again, thank you very much for taking your time and shedding light of this most one of a very pressing security issue in Europe and the Euro-Atlantic and the OSCE context. Thank you very much for attending today.